So I think at this point, people have figured out that I tend to like the GameCube generation. And when we had some GameCube Joy-Con controllers announced, I mean, it was obvious I was going to have to check them out at some point. And that's what we're doing today. We are going to take a look at the Nixie Wizard controller for the Switch. It's supposed to be like a Joy-Con replacement for either side of your system in handheld mode, or usable with a grip that they include in docked mode. So when I looked at it, I was curious, but I was also fairly hesitant, because could they actually get that true GameCube feel? I mean, really nail it with something like the Switch Joy-Con functionality added in? Well, that's what we're gonna look at today. Let's start first with a typical unboxing for the controller. And I noticed as I was opening it up, the packaging is pretty solid for the most part. Compared to other third-party controllers that you're opening the box, it's just falling apart in your hands. This is a higher quality overall for the box and the packaging. Inside, though, you do get the controller, a 3.5-foot USB-C to Type A cable for charging, 2 interchangeable joystick gates that we'll talk a bit more about later on, and then instructions. Removing the controller from the packaging, the first thing I really noticed is it's much wider than your standard GameCube controller. You can even see it kind of here. A lot of this has to do with the grip there in the middle, because if that was removed, where both of these kind of slide onto, and then you push them up against each other, it looks closer. In fact, if you compare it to something like the Wavebird, it's just about there, but because these are, of course, sliding onto either side of your Switch, so they need something to attach to here. It just adds that bit of thickness that, to be honest, kind of throws the whole thing off. Nonetheless, if you take a look at the front, you will notice, obviously, the GameCube layout with A, B, X, and Y. We have the C-stick that's graduated up to a full thumbstick, but still kept that yellow color scheme. On the left, we have a larger D-pad compared to the GameCube, and then the typical left gray thumbstick. You'll see plus and minus in their typical spots, and then we also have home, snapshot, and what amounts to a function button right below that. All the way at the bottom, you see the T buttons. Those are turbo buttons. You can assign different buttons like A or B to that, and it will press it in rapid succession by just holding the button down. And then right below that, you have a USB-C in for charging on either controller. You can charge them this way if you want to separately, or if you just slide it onto your Switch and leave it, say, in the dock, they will charge normally through the rails. On the back, you do have a macro button on either side, and then at the top, you have your standard shoulder buttons, L, R, ZL, ZR, and the controller does support things like gyro, rumble. Does not work with amiibos, but I feel like most of us assume that for any third-party controller out there at this time. And to be honest, it's kind of a small sacrifice to make for something like this. And really, if you look at the controller with a lot of the stuff they're offering here, there's quite a bit of functionality. You have your turbo, you have your macro buttons. You can also do things like change the rumble intensity. You can alter the LED brightness on here. There are quite a bit of things to customize when it comes to software, but also physically with the hardware, because you can change those gates out around either thumbstick, which for some you might not care, and it might seem more of a novelty factor. I think it's kind of neat that you can on the fly change these out. So rather than go from your standard octagon kind of setup for the gate, you can just go to a full circle, and it's not too bad, although it is a little finicky. You have to take it, you have to see those lines that line up with the dots, turn it counterclockwise to 45-degree angle, and then you rip the entire stick out of there. After this, you then line up the other gate that you want to install, twist it back into the place with the thumbstick underneath of it. I guess this is good for fighting games if you want to have kind of that 8-way gate, or if you want to then go over to something that's more like an action adventure or a shooting game, you want it to be a complete circle. It's just nice to have options. I also played around with the turbo buttons, and yeah, it just makes it so that if you're playing a mini game like in Pokemon Stadium, well, you can take down any of the hard CPUs pretty easily when it's time for Rattata to run on a conveyor belt. We do have, I guess, LED backlighting for these different buttons, specifically A, B, X, and Y. And I'm not really sure why this is a thing here, other than for marketing and to just be different. I don't see a lot of functionality here. Maybe somebody who loses track of X and Y, I guess that's a real thing there, but A and B are pretty straightforward, and at one point you get used to the buttons so much that you don't look at them because you're looking at the screen. So I just see this as more of a superficial thing. It's at least easy enough to turn off with the function button. It literally takes a second or two, but I guess it could have been better if they decided to go the route of being able to change the colors to whatever you'd like with RGB lighting. Otherwise, here it looks like they just illuminate with standard white LEDs. Oh, and they do turn on the Switch no problem, whether it's in handheld mode or you have it in TV mode. You can just press the little home button and the Switch will kick right on. I spent some time playing different games with the controller, whether it's in handheld mode or in TV mode, and I have some thoughts around this one. So the joysticks themselves are great. Really, any joystick that's at least decent now compared to the Joy-Con joysticks are going to be better. Just the travel distance, the control, the tension is just leagues above what we have with our current Joy-Con controllers. But for me, with this Nixie Wizard joypad, there's just so many issues with it that to me outweigh a lot of the benefits that we have. So the benefit of having a better grip is great, right? You don't necessarily feel as cramped. You have basically GameCube handles, but the entire time I'm using these, I'm realizing it just still doesn't feel like a GameCube controller, and what it feels like is a third-party Joy-Con controller that's completely masquerading as a GameCube controller. So when you pick these up, you have your standard A, B, X, and Y. It's feeding into the idea of you using a GameCube controller, but then you go and press ZR or even ZL. And it is just one of the least satisfying button presses I think I've ever seen on a controller. And they advertise it as being a good thing. Like the throw distance on it is incredibly short. But what you end up with is one that just doesn't feel very reliable and is the complete opposite end of the spectrum as what we've had with the GameCube controller, which had a very long press, sure, but it was an analog press that had that nice click or just chunk at the bottom when you hit the button inside. I also noticed that the D-pad is very poor, which is unfortunate because it should be a step above what we had with the GameCube considering it is larger, but it's a clicky D-pad. And if you press in the middle, you can hit all 4 points no problem. It has very, very little travel that's very similar to what we see with ZR and ZL, and I have to imagine this is going to have a ton of false button presses if you attempt something like Street Fighter. Also, it makes your Switch incredibly wide, and I guess we've had that with other grips already where the Switch looks kind of ridiculous to a point because they stick out so far, but this one goes even a little further than that, and I don't know if they had to be that aggressive with these grips considering it doesn't really feel like a GameCube controller anyway, so this is more aesthetics, not as much functionality. I will at least give them this though, it does fit in the dock. So if you just drop it in, again, it looks kind of funny, but sure, it'll sit right in there. You can grab it out, no problem. I would not recommend using these as a split Joy-Con setup. It just doesn't work well. It feels very lopsided in either hand. And good luck to anyone you hand one of these off to do the 2-player Joy-Con setup where each person gets a Joy-Con. And it sounds weird me saying that, but hey, they put SL and SR on there. I guess they did that for compatibility. So I guess technically it could be done. I just don't think it's a great idea. Also, they do have Hall effect sensors with these joysticks. While the jury's still out on the long-term ramifications of the more current Hall effect sensors we're getting right now with these different third-party accessories, history tells us we should be in pretty good shape if you look at something like the Dreamcast, and I would assume with how technology has continued to advance, we won't see these different joysticks drifting, but again, we have quite a bit of time to really test these different joysticks out to see what we exactly get in the long run. So let's go ahead and take these controllers apart. I'm going to start with the right Joy-Con here that has A, B, X, and Y, mostly because I wanted to see how exactly they're handling the illumination of the buttons. I have a good idea, but figure we'll take a look. On the back, at least they're using Phillips head screws, so we don't have to get a tri-wing screwdriver to take this apart. I guess that is a one-up over Nintendo on that. With the back off, we do see that they are using a weight inside just to add some extra heft to it. And we've seen this with other third-party controllers before, and I think the reason they're doing this is because the rumble motor is kind of one of those small disc motors that you may find in a cell phone or a tablet, something like that. And it kind of makes sense considering the intensity of the rumble is not great, or at least not overpowering in these Joy-Cons. It's not a huge deal because, to be honest, I usually turn my rumble down or even off depending on the game I'm playing, but just something to note. I also want to point out ZR, ZL, and Y, the press is just not very satisfying, and that's because they have this odd setup to where they're using a spring and almost a hinge to then have that ZR, ZL kind of push into the board with this tiny, tiny little switch and button, and it just, even when I'm sitting here trying to press it, it's not great. So it's very unfortunate to see this, because not only do you have kind of a sweet spot when you press down, when you get it just right, I still kind of question if I'm pressing it. I think just going with a more traditional trigger for the back would have been fine. In this case, I think they kind of overthought it, again, considering they wanted to put this in the marketing as being a good thing. Flipping back around to the front, we can see where they have A, B, X, and Y with sort of this rubber membrane. And you can see there's a hole in each button, and that's so that light can flow through it, because when removing it, we can see in the middle of each button, there's a little LED. And in this case, it's pretty straightforward how all this working with the LED in the middle, the hole through that rubber membrane for the buttons. And then you can see on the back of each button, you have sort of the clear plastic that's sort of frosted that will allow some of the light through, and you get that illumination effect on the front. The battery inside is 500 milliamp hours, and they do quote 8.5 hours. So fairly standard, I would say, but still lagging pretty far behind what we get with the standard Joy-Cons from Nintendo. Moving over to the left Joy-Con, the part here that I'm really curious about is the D-pad. All right, so we'll kind of tear this down, get to the front, and yeah, it's what I figured. They just have 4 buttons there. And in fact, the D-pad is kind of floating above the motherboard, and the spike in the middle where you normally have your pivot point does not touch the motherboard. It's not deep enough or long enough, I guess, to touch that board, which is why I'm able to press all 4 buttons no problem when I'm pressing the D-pad down, which is not great. Again, that's not going to do well for really anything, but obviously for fighting games. It's unfortunate because I've seen this D-pad setup before in other third-party controllers, and it's probably the poorest I've seen overall. Oh, and while we're in here, we can get a look at the Hall Effect joystick. There's not much to really see from the outside, but underneath of the stick, you will have magnets and then one piece kind of floating above it as you are moving around that joystick. So because there's no contact, you would assume there's not going to be nearly as much wear and tear as other joysticks where there is complete contact to detect where that joystick is in its movement. Overall, with the Nixie Wizard Wireless Joypad, I'm fairly disappointed, especially it coming in at the $70 price point. It just kind of seems like they were trying to play off of the nostalgia of the GameCube, which is seeing a pretty large resurgence now, without going all in. We do have some functionality with those analog triggers that the GameCube provides. Think of something like Mario Sunshine that I did check out with these controllers, and it was pretty bad. So I think that would be the better route to go, as in if someone's going to take another shot at this with bringing the GameCube to the Switch, to really go for it. And maybe that company would have to be Nintendo so they can really nail the overall look and feel of it. I also don't think you have to go as aggressive with the handles on either side to get a better grip, because we already live with the Joy-Cons that are not great when it comes to people with larger hands. So I think if you can get that GameCube form factor down pat and not worry about things like lighting up A, B, X, and Y, I think you could actually have something here that would probably do pretty well. And while I think it's a shame that I can't recommend this controller outright, especially at its current price, I do hope we eventually see a GameCube Joy-Con controller. I just think it'd be really cool to have, and I know we've seen Shank do a modification to a GameCube controller to get to that point, but we have to use the actual GameCube controller. I would like to see one that's brand new, that has some newer functionality that we see with the current controllers, but still have that true GameCube feel. Maybe we just need Nintendo to do it, and something tells me if they haven't done it yet, they probably won't, but who knows? They do some weird things. But let me know what you guys think about the Nixie Wizard controller for the Switch down below. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.